Hey y'all, welcome back to Right at the Wire. Well, we've reached part 4 of the Elements of Handicapping series of the Kentucky Derby, and that is pace. So let's take a look at the contenders. Okay, we're at part 4 of pace, and that's a look at the pace fractions for each contender in the Derby preps to evaluate if they can get the distance and factor in the Kentucky Derby. We want to see how far they can carry their speed. Now, we'll use Forte as an example of how we do this. You see those 1 FR, 2 FR, and 3 FR after each race. Those are fractions. So the first fraction, second, and third. In a route, the first fraction is the half-mile call. So we have 1 FR is the half mile, 2 FR is the 6 furlong mark, and 3 FR is the final time. So we look at those numbers, and from those we derive the pace parameters. And EP is early pace. That's the second call in a route. So we base it on the Florida Derby here, or the last race, and you see that Forte's early pace was 55.86. The next number is the average pace. That's taking the EP and SP, which we'll get to in a second, add those two, divide by 2, and that's the average pace for the race. The sustained pace is a representation of how a horse carries his pace throughout. And what you do is you take the second call, or the 2 FR, add it to the third call, the 3 FR, and divide by 2, and that's a sustained pace. Important thing to note, any horse that leads all the contenders in average and sustained pace usually wins the Kentucky Derby. Not always, but usually. The top 5 in average and sustained pace combined are usually exceptional win candidates. Something to keep in mind. So we look and we see Forte as a model of consistency, don't we? He basically runs the same race every time. So it goes back to what we were saying. He's not regressing. He's not progressing. He's plateaued for the most part. You do see a little bit of improvement in the Florida Derby in that final fraction. And as a rule, any final fraction over 53 is good for the Derby. Anything under that is borderline. So just a little benchmark to think about. So he's pretty much plateaued. It just means kind of other horses are catching up to him to a degree. But regardless, he's still and running at a very high level, and he's very competitive for this race. Now, we took the fractions from his last race, and we prorate that out to a 1.25 mile time, and you see it would be 48, 1:11 and 3, and 2 minutes flat, or 2 minutes and 3. That's an exceptional 1.25 mile time. Doesn't mean he's going to run it. It's just an approximation. If he ran like he did in the Florida Derby, that would be a time commensurate with that performance. So based upon the fact that his numbers are, top of the list, he gets an A, and he's definitely a competitor in the Derby and a likely win candidate. Angel of Empire, you see the kind of progression you want to see. You see 51.56, 51.83, 53.82 for the 3 straight final fractions. That's the kind of progression you absolutely want to see. You also see that his first 2 fractions for each race are about the same. That means he's carrying his speed longer, and that's exactly what you want to see heading into the Derby. You see his prorated 1.25 mile time is 2:02 and 3. That's about competitive what usually would be a winning time, and roughly. So he's definitely a competitor, and he gets an A- just because the first couple races were a little light, but the fact is he's definitely moving in the right direction, and we know he's going to want more ground, so he gets an A-. Tapit Trice is heading in the right direction as well. You see those final fractions, 53, 53.26, so he is progressing, and you see his pace numbers have stayed about the same. So he's definitely, as the distances are getting longer, he's getting stronger. So you definitely want to see that. His prorated 1.25 mile time would be competitive in any year for the most part, and so he has all strong numbers. Gets an A- just because the Tampa Derby was a little funky, and he's only got 2 preps per se, so he gets an A-, but he's definitely a win candidate. Dermisotagaki, I have to point out, I was extremely curious about the pace numbers for this horse. I have not been able to obtain the actual pace numbers, so here's what I did. The UAE Derby is measured in meters. So I converted that to 1 mile and 3/16, as well as what the metric representations would be for each fraction. Then I hand timed the race. So these are very rough numbers, and I don't want for 1 minute to claim that these are authentic. It's an approximation, and that's why the asterisk is there. If you look at it, you will see Dermisotagaki was pretty one-paced all the way around the track on the front end. That's not a big surprise. That is an extremely competitive string of pace numbers. And his EP, AP, and SP are very competitive with the better horses in this Derby field, and I'm not totally surprised at that. If you look at the prorated 1.25 mile time based upon hand-timed approximations, you see he would get on the lead and have really soft fractions, 48, 112, and finish with a 201 and 3. Is it logical to expect that he would get those slower fractions on the top end? Probably not, but it'll be at least an honest pace, and he's certainly competitive. Gets a B+ only because he was running against a competition. We're not sure quite how good it is, but he's definitely a competitor here. Practical move is what you don't want to see, and we've harped on it. We had questions about it, and sometimes your suspicions get realized in the numbers, and this is what we see. You see the San Felipe. He ran a really solid race, 55, 54, and 53.86 is an excellent final fraction. But you go to the Santa Anita Derby, and there's a couple of things that are a little troubling. Number one, he had to run a little faster on the front end, 56.53, and he finished with a 52.96. That's a regression, obviously. The distance is getting longer. His final fraction is getting smaller. Not good. Not what you want to see. He's a high-energy horse. He runs with a lot of energy early. That does not help his endeavor, especially when you consider he saved so much ground on the rail in both races. You're not going to be able to do that in the Derby. So he is pretty up against it. If you take that Santa Anita Derby, however, you prorate the 1.25 mile time, it looks pretty competitive. But the problem is that that's only representative at 1.125 miles. At 1.25 miles, his final fraction is likely to be significantly less. And so for that reason, he hasn't done anything wrong, but he is regressing pace-wise, so he gets a C. And I would probably not want to use him pace-wise. Two Fills is another one that's a bit of a quandary. We've got two different kinds of race to evaluate. If you look at his synthetic race in the Jeff Ruby, he looks like he's a definite fit, and 53.92 in the final fraction. If he was able to run to that at 1.25 miles, he would be a very strong win candidate. But we're running this on dirt. You look at his two dirt preps, it's a different story. His last race on dirt in the Risen Star, he got a 50.40 final fraction. That's not nearly good enough. It was a progression from the LeCompte, which he had 49.32. So he is progressing, and I think it's likely that the Jeff Ruby showed a progression as well. And I think he's probably going to move forward again in this race. I just don't think it's going to be enough. And if you look at his synthetic prorated 1.25 miles time, that's pretty awesome. It's the second best of any of the competitors. The problem is we're running this on dirt, and if you look at his prorated 1.25 miles time on dirt, 2:05 and 1 isn't going to cut it whatsoever. So he gets a C because for dirt, Two Fills is a fighter, and I think it's likely that he'll work his tail off to stay in the race, but I can't see him as a win candidate. I just based on those numbers. Hit Show is another one. You see some progression, but I don't think it looks like it's a cut below. You see, from the Withers to the Wood Memorial, he definitely built on what he had been doing. So he is moving in the right direction. That is absolutely true. And can we expect another move forward? Perhaps. There's other reasons to believe that maybe that's not so likely, but he is a May foal as well, so he's still growing. And So I'll kind of buck the trend a little bit. I kind of think this one's going to run a little better. I don't think it's going to be good enough to win the race. However, I think he can be competitive and perhaps factor late. He gets a B because he was running in New York, didn't beat anything, and so we still have a little bit of a question about his competitiveness. But I think from a pace perspective, he's probably going to move forward. Just not sure how much it's going to factor. Kings Barnes is another puzzlement because of the Louisiana Derby and that ridiculously slow pace. If you look at those pace numbers, that would a 54.27 final fraction in the Derby would win it easily. Easily. He would blow the field away if he ran that. He's not going to do that for a couple reasons. Obviously, the pace isn't going to be that slow. He's not going to be able to get on the front end alone without any company, without anybody challenging him. That's not going to happen. Okay? So let's try to look at a race. The only other one we really had was the optional claimer that he ran in at Fairgrounds before then, or at Tampa, rather. And we look at the fractions are markedly different. Now, look at the first two. He had to run appreciably faster in the first fraction. And look at the second and the third. Now, that's indicative of a horse running in his second race. So it's not a bad thing, but it's just not going to cut it as far as the Derby goes. So which one do you use? That's the problem with Kings Barnes. If we use the Louisiana Derby numbers, they look pretty competitive. But if we use his second start, not so much. So I think, is it likely he can be competitive in this race? Yeah, probably. But it's so uncertain. I mean, I think he's going to get the distance. I don't worry about that. But he's never really had to face any real challenge. And I wonder about that as far as this goes. But so he's in the mix. I mean, he's going to get the distance based on his pedigree, so he gets a C. Mage, on the other hand, is another one with only 3 starts, but is moving in the right direction. You see the Fountain of Youth, that would be completely understandable for a horse running in his first route in his second start, and that's exactly what he did. And the fact that he was doing it at the graded stakes level was pretty damn good. You see in the Florida Derby, his first and second fraction were roughly the same as they were in the first, but he carried his speed longer. You see that 52.33. That's a big progression at a longer distance. That's exactly what you want to see. And it bodes pretty well that his next effort is going to be a move forward from that. You see his prorated mile and a quarter time based on the Florida Derby is very competitive with this group. So he gets a B+ only because it's his third start. But he's really one to watch. I really like the progression with this one, and I think it's pretty exciting to think about him in the Derby. Verifying is moving forward. He's progressing. You look at the Rebel and the Arkansas, the Bluegrass Stakes. That's meant to be. I'm sorry about that. And you see a progression there. Coupled with the only thing is, though, that was kind of a dubious ride in the Rebel. And he was up against a really hot pace, and you can see his first fraction was appreciably faster than it was in the Bluegrass, which means it's totally understandable that his last fraction would be slower than it was in the Bluegrass, where the pace was more reasonable. So you can look at that and say, well, is he really progressing, or is he basically running the same race again? Not really sure. However, if we just look at the Bluegrass Stakes, that's a borderline competitive Kentucky Derby pace line. 52.89 puts him right about there, but not quite on top. If we prorate that out to his mile and a quarter time, you can see it's pretty competitive. I just got a feeling that that's the max this one can offer. He ran a 1 in the Bluegrass Stakes thoroughgraph wise, and granted, we're talking about pace here, but I just the indication is that this is probably the best he's going to do, and likely a regression is possible. From the pace perspective, strictly, he's borderline, and we'll leave it there. And that's kind of why he gets a B+, but I don't think he's going to do much better. Disarm is another one that's kind of hard to figure out. You got that Louisiana Derby to deal with. If he ran those fractions, he'd blow this field away. No question about it, but it's not going to happen. They're 54-7-4. He'd win this Derby by 10 lengths if he could do that a mile and a quarter. He can't. He won't. So that race is kind of hard to figure out what we have with Disarm. If we look at the Lexington Stakes, there's another one that's hard to figure out because we're pretty sure he wasn't tuned up all the way because all he needed to do was finish third. So really hard to know. If we look at the other building blocks, then this one probably factors. I gave, again, 2 times, one based on the Louisiana Derby, one based on the Lexington, and you can see, interestingly enough, the times come out about the same. So that would put him about competitive, not quite. So is it possible this one can take another step forward? It is. Is it going to be significant enough given the rush of training and everything else? I don't know. Disarm is very much a fence horse for those reasons. Reincarnate has been, what I would consider to be a disappointment. And now you look at his pace numbers and it bears it right out. You see in the Sham where it was a mile out in California where he was on the front end, ran pretty hot, and was able to finish with a fairly mediocre fraction, but it was a small field. So we figured, okay, well, he'll be a front runner in the Rebel and the Arkansas Derby, and neither one happened. The Rebel Stakes in particular, he had that bad start. And he finished okay, but 52.48 is not really a competitive. It's a marginally competitive number for our purposes. And you see, he followed that up in the Arkansas Derby where he had to rate a little closer to the pace, and he really didn't have anything to compete with at the end. So this one is not moving in the right direction as far as I'm concerned, pace-wise. And he's middle of the pack. He's a C. I mean, he's a big-time fence to me. He would have to everybody keeps thinking he's going to go on the lead, and he could, but, I mean, I don't know. I think he's a major league borderline horse. Pace-wise, he's a toss. Rocket Can is one I think is pretty much flattened out. And the pace numbers kind of indicate that he's pretty much gone as far as he's going to go. The last fraction is a little bit of a build on the Fountain of Youth, but not enough to consider him to be a major competitor here. I think he can run with these guys. I just don't know that he's going to have enough to factor in the race. Could he back his way into fourth? Yes, it's possible, but that's the best I think this one can do from the other things we've discussed about him. But pace-wise, he doesn't make it. Excuse me. Lord Miles, you can see, you look at his 3 races and you're seeing exactly what you want to, is a steady progression each race. Does he have, well, let's put it this way. The Wood Memorial, that race would not cut it in the Derby. He would be marginal. He would be probably borderline, like middle of the road. So he needs another move forward. The question is he going to do it? He's got the pedigree to. He is headed in the right direction. If we base what we have here, what we look at here, he has steady growth. And that would mean that another move forward is highly likely pace-wise. And if he does have one, that puts him in the mix. I don't think he's fast enough to win this race. But I think based upon those numbers, he could definitely be an exotics possibility. So because he's on the right track, progression-wise, he gets a B. Sun Thunder seems to have sputtered out. You see those fractions. The Louisiana Derby is sort of an aberration. He didn't have any pace to run to. You see how slow he was early on. And he closed with a decent fraction, but he was nowhere near factoring in the race because the pace was so slow. So obviously he needs pace to run to. The Risen Star, he had it to a degree. And you see he finished second, but his final fraction was kind of weak. And the Bluegrass, he was able to engage a little bit more early, but he didn't. His final fraction really isn't going to cut it. This one's going to need a very hot pace to be involved in this race, and I doubt he's going to get it this year. He's been competitive. I think he's one you can think about for underneath at very best, but probably not going to be a factor in the race because he's too pace dependent. Continuar, again, I approximated his fractions based upon hand timing the UAE Derby, so please do not consider these to be granite. They're just approximations. You can see he was pretty competitive in the first two fractions, stayed right behind Dermisotagaki. It was a merry-go-round race. It went 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way around the track. But his final fraction, that's where Dermisotagaki started pulling away. Now, you can look at that a couple of ways. You can say, number one, well, it just validates Continuar is not good enough. You could also say his jockey said, hey, we're not going to beat him. Let's just stick with third. And because they'd gone 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way around the track, he just sort of just kept running. Continuar is a grinder. He's not, probably doesn't have, the turn of foot to win the Derby. But he will keep running. So this is the kind of horse that even though you look at his numbers and say, well, he's probably not going to factor, he still might just keep running, and that'll end up getting him fourth in the Derby. So it's a kind of a damn if you do, damn if you don't horse. From a pace perspective, on this stuff, from what I saw from the UAE Derby, he doesn't qualify. But again, he's got a ton of stamina, but not much speed. So that's the kind of horse maybe you want to think about on the bottom at a price. Race Kane, it really didn't build on what he did in the Gotham. That was a one-turn race. He went to 2 turns, and you can see that second fraction, he tried to get himself into the race by making a big move, and he had nothing left in the tank to build on that. And he flattened out, and that 52.27 is not going to cut it in the Derby. Not overly certain whether this one has a move forward in him or not. And in fact, it's not really, you wouldn't say from 1 turn to 2 turn as a progression. It's more a step aside. So he kind of gets a C- because I don't think he's going to be competitive in the race. Confidence game is progressing. Look at the LeCompte and the Rebel Stakes, and you do see a progression there. The thing is, though, is it going to be good enough to factor with the very best in this race? And the answer is probably no. Is he training all the way up to the Derby? Could he potentially move forward? It's possible, but it probably isn't going to be good enough. That's the bottom line. And this is another one that presents a big problem. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. He's had 7 races, 6 of which he's been in the money. So he finds his way to get into the money. So this is one maybe you want to think about the bottom of your exotics, but it looks to me that Rebel Stakes looked like he was all in. That was the best he could possibly do. So from a visual standpoint, I don't think a move forward is likely. From a number standpoint, it's possible. But is it going to be enough? I don't think so. Jace's Road, I don't like at all. I just haven't liked what I've seen. The Southwest Stakes, we can forgive the mud. The Gun Runner was a pretty good race, wire to wire at a mile, but the Louisiana Derby, he had everything his way. He had slow fractions. He was up on near the lead, and he had every opportunity to go get Kings Barnes, and he couldn't do it. Even with the slow fractions, 52.93 is a borderline final fraction, and he certainly is not going to get that pace scenario in the Derby. So I did 2 times. You can see both of them either way are non-competitive. One I based upon the Gun Runner, I think, and the other one on the Louisiana Derby. Neither one cuts it. He's a toss. Skinner is a welcome addition, and boy, is this one exciting to think about. Look at his last 2 races. The San Felipe, 53.27. Santa Anita Derby, 53.6. So he's getting better as the distances are getting longer. Here's the other thing that you got to like. His first fraction was in the San Felipe a 54. In the Santa Anita, it was a 56. The second fraction was a 53. The third fraction is a 53.6. So he's carrying his speed longer. You got to love that. The San Felipe, he made that big middle move and flattened out, but this time the Santa Anita Derby, he was able to stay in the race much better. So you look at that prorated mile and a quarter time, that's extremely competitive. So with the progression, also, let's consider that he's going to a track that's more favorable to the way he wants to run than Santa Anita is. You got to really like. There's a lot of good things to like about Skinner, and from a pace perspective, he's definitely headed in the right direction. So our pace parameters, as I mentioned, we have EP, AP, and SP. And AP and SP, any horse that has the top in both leads both is a serious win candidate for the Derby. And in this case, it's Forte. Now, granted, Dermisotagaki's numbers are approximations, as are Continuars. But, if you look at the other contenders, it basically looks like your top five here: Forte, Dermisotagaki, Angel of Empire, Hit Show, and Mage. They're the top five for the AP and SP. So those are the ones we want to think about. Tapit Trice probably we want to think about too. We'll throw him in there. We draw a line at where the SP is 53 or lower. So any horse with a 53 or above, we want to be thinking about. Anyone below, we probably don't want to. So that's our criterion there. So if we look at the final evaluation, our definites we want to use are Forte, Angel of Empire, Tapit Trice, Dermisotagaki, Hit Show, Mage, Lord Miles, and I'm sorry I didn't add him, but put Skinner in there instead of Sun Thunder. Our possibles are Practical Move, King's Barnes, Verifying, Disarm, Continuar, and let's put Sun Thunder in there as a possible. Those are ones we're borderline about. It will have to, based upon what we consider the scenario pace-wise to be, we can mix and match and determine who of them we're going to use. And then our tosses, based upon pace only: Two Fills, Reincarnate, Rocket Can, Race King, Confidence Game, and Jace's Road. So that's pace. So we've concluded our four pillars of handicapping: form, class, speed, and pace. So now the picture should be pretty clear as to who our bona fide contenders are and who our tosses are. Of course, there's going to be a couple of horses that are going to, depending on your preference and depending upon a few other factors, they're conditional uses, let's say, but they're not necessarily what we would fit in our contender profile. But we'll have the ability to mix and match, of course, and hopefully our analysis has given you the ability to evaluate them on your own and decide who, in fact, you consider to be the contenders and who the pretenders are. We'll have more Kentucky Derby coverage all next week, and this is just the beginning of it. We're going to have our final presentation where we take a look at all the factors as we've discussed them and evaluate and come up with our short list of win candidates as well as prime Derby contenders. So be on the lookout for that. As soon as the post positions are drawn, we'll talk about that too and evaluate it, see who it helps, who it hurts. And then we'll probably put something together in terms of a wagering strategy as we see it, and maybe give you some ideas on some things to think about on the day. Usually the undercard is pretty good. So there should be a lot of neat wagering opportunities, and we'll take a look at those for sure. Of course, if you like what you see here, please like and subscribe. We do thank you for coming by, and of course, we really appreciate your viewership, and thanks for being part of this community. And keep those comments coming. As I said, I always love to hear from you guys, good, bad, or otherwise. So until we talk again, be well.